समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Is this the next Cuban Missile Crisis? So, what is happening between America, Venezuela with a nuclear submarine in the Caribbean? Let's understand this new flashpoint. Just as the world was distracted by chatter about a supposed realignment between Russia, India, and China at the SCO, and as Beijing has flaunted its copycat American-style weapons at its National Day parade, something far more dangerous may be unfolding on the other side of the globe. Is Latin America about to witness a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0? Now, the signs are alarming. The United States has moved warships, thousands of Marines, and a nuclear-powered submarine into the Caribbean Sea. The Trump administration has doubled its bounty on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, now offering $50 million for his capture and arrest. Washington openly calls Maduro not a legitimate leader, but a narco-terrorist running a cartel state. The big questions practically write themselves. For instance, why is the US deploying military assets so close to Venezuela? Is Washington preparing for a real invasion? How might Russia and China respond given their ties to Maduro? Is this truly a Cuban Missile Crisis redux or just strategic theatrics? And finally and importantly, what does all this mean for India's energy security, considering Venezuela was once a major supplier of oil to India? Now, to answer these and understand these, we need to go beyond the headlines into the world of drug cartels, petrostates, failed revolutions, and great power posturing. So, the part one, the US military buildup. The facts are stark. In the past weeks, Washington has ordered a major naval deployment in the Caribbean, citing a crackdown on narcotics trafficking. Warships have been stationed south of the Dominican Republic, and a nuclear-powered submarine has been positioned in the waters near Venezuela. The US military even carried out a strike on a Venezuelan drug vessel, signaling that this is not just empty saber rattling. In fact, Trump actually posted about it. So while in his first term, Trump did muse about invading Venezuela, in his second term, he only spoke of taking Greenland by force and kept referring to military options for Panama. Now, so far, he has deployed the B-2 bombers against Iran, but somehow Venezuela was forgotten by the international community. Now, with this political comeback, Venezuela is once again a target. The official justification? That's drugs. The Trump White House argues that Venezuelan cartels are flooding US communities with cocaine and fentanyl, and that Maduro himself, the president, leads the trafficking network. And that's not just rhetoric. Back in 2020, during Trump's first presidency, the US Justice Department indicted Maduro for narco-terrorism. They accused him of running the so-called Cartel of the Suns, which allegedly shipped hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States over 2 decades. Now, this particular outfit has been designated a terrorist organization by the US. So in 2025, the bounty on Maduro's head has been doubled, like I mentioned, to $20 million. And still, military experts in the region caution against assuming a full-scale invasion. As one of the former US ambassadors has put it, this looks like a show of force, not a use of force. With Venezuela's population of about 26 million, its mountainous terrain, jungles, and several urban centers, it would take thousands of troops and other capabilities, and not just 4,000 Marines or one nuclear-powered submarine, to really topple Maduro militarily. So the question is, if not invasion, then what? Washington's strategy looks more like pressure and isolation, making Maduro's rule untenable through sanctions, intimidation, and displays of military might. Now let's come to the part two. So what has been the Venezuelan response? Now Caracas, which is the capital of Venezuela, isn't taking this quietly. Maduro has blasted Washington's moves as part of a broader campaign of regime change disguised as a war on drugs. Now, he's mobilized his base, calling on Venezuelans to prepare for resistance. In dramatic speeches, Maduro claims he can arm and mobilize 4.5 million militia members to fight back against the US incursion. Now, his message is simple and, in my opinion, rather cliched, that this is not about cocaine, this is about sovereignty. Now, to him, the US is not targeting criminals. It's targeting his government itself. And that is not an unreasonable interpretation. After all, Washington no longer even recognizes him as Venezuela's president. Instead, it backs opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez, who many Latin American neighbors of Venezuela also support. But we'll come to that later. Now, the part 3. Is this really a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0? The comparison is tempting. American warships in the Caribbean, threats of a regime change, a Latin American Marxist leader claiming foreign aggression, the echoes of 1962 are hard to ignore. But let's be clear, this is not a carbon copy. In fact, this is not even a poor copy. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was about nuclear weapons. That crisis happened because the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev secretly deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US coast, in response to US missiles in Turkey and a desire to defend communist Cuba from American threats, especially if you remember the failed Bay of Pigs invasion by the US and the CIA. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of a nuclear war. Ultimately, that crisis was diffused when the Soviets pulled out of their missiles in exchange for a US pledge not to invade Cuba and secretly a withdrawal of US missiles from Turkey. Now, that was a direct nuclear confrontation between two superpowers in a very different geopolitical time. Today, Venezuela is not even hosting a Russian base, let alone hosting Russian nuclear weapons. What we have instead is a different kind of crisis. Washington sees Maduro as a criminal narco-dictator. Maduro paints himself as a victim of imperial aggression. So the risks are real, but they are not nuclear. So, Cuban Missile Crisis? Not exactly. A crisis? Certainly. Now, the part 4. What about Russia and China, and will they intervene? Now, this is a $1 million question. Could Maduro's friends in Moscow and Beijing save him? Let's take Russia's position first. Russia has stood by Maduro diplomatically, recognizing his disputed July 2025 election win. Moscow and Caracas have signed 17 cooperation agreements last year on intelligence and energy, and Russia has historically supplied weapons, conducted joint exercises, and even flown its bombers to Venezuela. But military intervention, that's a different ballgame, and I think it's highly unlikely. Why? Because Russia is overstretched. Its war in Ukraine continues to drain resources. Now remember that Moscow has already failed to support its allies elsewhere. Now it couldn't save Assad in Syria, where Russia had an air base and a naval base, couldn't aid Iran during its clash with Israel in the recent 12-day war, and couldn't meaningfully intervene or help in Armenia or Azerbaijan, ultimately getting pushed to margins in the Caucasus. So the point is that if Russia can't project decisive power in its own backyard and crucial theaters of interest, it certainly cannot do so in the Caribbean. Now let's come to China's position. Now China is, as always, trickier. Caracas owes Beijing billions from oil-backed loans, many of which it has failed to repay. China still imports Venezuelan oil, sometimes openly and often through opaque channels, but its enthusiasm has waned. Now, it's true that China gives Maduro political cover at the UN. It's also true that Beijing would oppose any US-led regime change on principle. But would China send warships or troops? Absolutely not. Latin America is not an arena where China wants direct confrontation or involvement. The most China might do is rhetorical support and economic lifelines, not boots on the ground, even remotely. In fact, China was silent, and this is interesting. China was silent when Brazil blocked Venezuela's entry into the BRICS. And that brings me to Maduro's neighbors. Now, Cuba remains loyal comparatively, but Cuba itself is a weakened ally. Colombia and Guyana are wary, given border tensions. The regional consensus has long been against Maduro. So, unlike Cuba in 1962, which had the Soviet Union fully backing it, Venezuela today is largely alone in its neighborhood. Many of its neighbors like Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Ecuador, etc., actually wish for a regime change. But before I now come to India, first of all, why is Venezuela so broke despite its vast reserves of oil? Now, this crisis is not just about geopolitics, it's also about economics. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and yet it is one of the poorest, most dysfunctional economies in Latin America. The question is why? And I can tell you 3 words: petrostate, corruption, and mismanagement. For decades, oil revenues funded populist programs while state institutions rotted. Hugo Chavez, and later Maduro turned the PDVSA, the national oil company, into a political machine rather than a serious energy firm. Now, add to that sweeping US sanctions, and oil output collapsed. At its peak, Venezuela pumped more than 3 million barrels a day. Today, production has fallen below 800,000 barrels. The country is in debt, inflation is rampant, and basic goods are scarce. The result? What was once South America's richest nation is now a humanitarian disaster zone. And finally, what relevance does it hold for India? And this is the last part. And I'll tell you why it matters for New Delhi. Now, for years, Venezuela was a major oil supplier to India. In fact, by 2012, Venezuela was India's 3rd largest crude supplier, behind only Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Now, Hugo Chavez, Maduro's predecessor, had actually visited Delhi in 2005. And when he passed away in 2013, when Maduro took over, so the Jawaharlal Nehru University, considered a left bastion, officially mourned. Now, all the oil imports changed with the US sanctions. Washington pressured refiners to stop buying Venezuelan crude, and India's imports collapsed and had to diversify. So, if Maduro falls and sanctions are lifted under a new government, Venezuela could once again become a key energy partner for India, helping diversify supplies away from the Middle East and Russia. Now, that's a strategic opportunity. On the other hand, if the standoff drags on, India will stay locked out of Venezuelan oil at a time when the pressure to diversify its imports is pretty high. So while India may not have any direct skin in the game, but if the sanctions are lifted, India stands to gain. I'll keep a track of what happens in Latin America and if the regime sustains or collapses. Stay tuned.